you all for being here again. We have two readers for this session. Valerie Wayson is a writer and teacher who's taught in Madagascar, Iraqi Kurdistan, and Texas. She holds an MFA in creative writing from Georgia College and is pursuing a PhD at Texas Tech University. We also have Leanne Gallaway-Mitchell, who grew up in working on a family farm in Lockney, Texas. Her essays and poems can be found in Bat City Review, Iron Horse Literary Review, which is our hometown review, Oh Dark 30 and Terrain.org, among others. She is an MFA candidate in creative writing at the University of Arizona. Thank you.
So I'm going to read today. It's a chapter out of a memoir that I've been working on for a long time, and it is not this region. So the Sowell Conference usually deals with this region, the Southwest region, but what really strikes me is how the place affects its people. This is a very place-based conference, and I found out Leanne's doing the same thing. We're both writing about how place affects the people who live there. So this is about Madagascar, where I was in the Peace Corps, and what really struck me when I lived there is the prevalence of death. There are so many different ways to die. You can die from, there's so many things. There's malaria, there's dirty water, there's accidents, there's all kinds of things. But at the same time, it was stunningly beautiful, and it was almost like the price you paid to see this kind of beauty. So this is called Heavier Concerns. When my Peace Corps interviewer asked me what I would do without a gym, I replied that if we're issued bikes, I'd take bike rides. He complimented me on my response, saying it showed problem-solving skills, and this compliment bolstered my confidence and tricked me into thinking I'd already solved a problem I hadn't yet encountered. While actually in Madagascar, though, I took few bike rides. Brickaville, my village, on the main road between the two largest cities in Madagascar, Tana and Tamatave, was described in the Brad Guide as a truck stop town where you didn't want to get stuck. Although this road was paved, because of its steep twists and turns going from mountains to sea level, Peace Corps classified it as dangerous. Most of Brickaville lay along this road, which was why it was a trade hub and a point of distribution between the larger cities and smaller villages. When I started biking, I steered toward Tana and rode for half an hour before turning back. The route was hilly, and there were places I would heave up an incline before coasting down the other side, the wind buffeting my flushed face and pressing the brim of my hat over my eyes. My preferred biking time was dusk, and every day I was dumbstruck at the way the light hit the green palm and banana and coconut trees, bathing everything in a warm glow. I first found my love for Madagascar on my bike on this road. The provisor of the school, my boss, agreed with Peace Corps that the road, full of trucks and taxi bruises careening past dogs and chickens and children, was dangerous. Laure, the secretary of the school and my self-appointed best friend, tried to discourage me by pointing at a teacher whose son had been hit and killed by a truck. I'd already noticed the woman, whose hair was as short as a man's and who smoked, both of which broke, or at least bent, basic social mores for Malagasy women. Laure also didn't like my workout attire. When I returned after my ride to the classroom where I lived, children were still loitering in the courtyard of the school, chatting with friends. Laure, scandalized, eyed the students, eyed my sweaty backside, and whispered in my ear, "Il faut changer." A taxi bruise drove off the bridge and into the river, killing a man, woman, and child. No one I knew. Next, I tried running. I ran around the soccer field, dodging muddy puddles as gleeful children chased me. Maybe if I'd been stronger, I would have embraced the children's laughter, seen it as an opportunity to teach about fitness and health. But I was too conscious of how slow I ran, which they loved to point out when they sped past me, too conscious of the fat on my arms and belly and thighs that did not appear on theirs, which they also loved to point out daily. Ma 20 now, they'd say, and Malagasy, but then they'd remember that I didn't speak Gassy very well, so they'd add in French, tu es grosse. Then they'd gauge my reaction, confer amongst themselves, and several would come out with, "You are fat," almost simultaneously, yelling it out in triumph at being the first to think of it. Some might accidentally say is instead of are, but the others would set them straight. Then, just in case something was lost in translation, one or two would bulge out their cheeks and round their arms in front of them as if resting on a great girth. Everyone did this, not just the children, even my coworkers in the school. It was amazing how similar the conversations were. The same cycling through of languages, the same puffing up of cheeks. They didn't mean to hurt my feelings. I think it was actually a compliment, or at least not an insult. They never understood that it should bother me. The years I lived there, Madagascar was the 8th poorest country in the world. 2/3 of the population lived below subsistence level. Being fat is not a bad thing. Their health issues are not heart attacks or cancer, but syphilis, polio, malaria, in some regions, the bubonic plague. Many are malnourished, discernible from distended bellies and orange-tipped hair. Losing weight, burning calories, are not concepts many of them can understand. I could see their thoughts in their faces. Muscles are from labor, and you don't labor. I wasn't skinny, but I wasn't exactly fat. I was at or under the medically overweight for my height line. Compared to the Malagasy, I was pretty big, but also at only 5'4", I tower over most of them, even the men. I tried not to take these comments personally. When someone dies, the Malagasy collect money from well-wishers, put it in an envelope, and present it to the grieving family, accompanied by a speech expressing condolences from the most senior member of the group. The first time I witnessed this was in training. The maid's father had died. When we gave her the envelope, she involuntarily let out a sob before stifling with her hands clasped to her mouth. The girl was young, around 18, and shy, and her grief was so raw that I immediately teared up. I dropped my eyes to the floor. She was silent through the rest of the speech, but I could see her body shaking almost violently. Trying to keep my own tears from being visible, I watched her feet. One was clenched over the other, the toes white-knuckled. I ran on the blacktop for a while, which came with the same warnings as before, and I became a source of amusement for adults as well as children. As I was the white girl, there was dressed in a ridiculous outfit and running to the point of sweating when there wasn't anywhere to get to. The attention, not the trucks, eventually drove me behind the train tracks, where I found hidden pathways through the sugar cane and rice fields. The earth was red, the rice fields impossibly green, and the sky was orange and purple and pink. The sugar cane reached 10 feet tall and gave the impression of solitude. I constantly tried to stay busy, to do productive things. I set aside several hours a day to lesson plan and grade papers, and when I didn't have anything else to do, I read from Les Trois Mousquetaires, thinking that improving my French was at least more constructive than pleasure reading, which I still did, on average 7 hours a day. I listened to music or BBC on my shortwave radio while I cooked dinner, washed the dishes, swept the floor. I never let myself think. While running, though, I had revelations. I composed journal entries in my head, pinpointed where I stood on important issues. I pictured David Letterman interviewing me in front of an adoring crowd that hung on my every word. Letterman would be equally adoring as he probed my stance on issues from the futility of country development to the palm-sized spider that lived in my outdoor shower. My runs grew to an hour each evening. My stride lengthened. I felt strong, calm, and centered. It was my favorite time of day. Mati, 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 St. Andrew Mati, Laura exclaimed. Death, death, death. Every day, death. Laura no longer had a husband, and her secretary's salary only went so far. Constantly giving money to grieving families meant that she probably wouldn't eat meat this week. Who died, I asked. An 18-year-old boy. From what? Sickness. What kind of sickness? Just sickness. This said exasperated. The situation was not unusual. The cause was unknown. Dirty water, malaria, any of the other millions of things that could happen. Did it matter? The provisor and his wife called me into their house. The wife's presence startled me, as she preferred Tomatop to Brickaville, and I rarely saw her. She was middle-aged, matronly, mustached, wearing a thin tank top over a braless, pendulous breast. Tu vas être violée, she claimed, hoping that the threat of rape would end the matter. It didn't. I rarely saw anyone on my runs, and mostly they were surprised when I jogged by. People were generally solicitous to me. They wanted to be my friend, and I never felt myself to be in danger. The most dangerous event on one of my runs was the time the runaway zebu thundered down the narrow path, its owner shouting "Aumbi" in warning, chasing after the bull. I jumped in the mud and it ran by. I'd never taught before Peace Corps, and in those first days in the classroom, I realized some things. Number one, whoever came up with the saying, "Those who can't do, teach," never tried to teach. Number two, just because someone knows English, can spell words and form grammatically correct sentences, does not mean that someone can convey this information to someone else. 3, the daydream that I'd had of being perfectly adjusted, perfectly fluent, an asset to the community, and who would improve the lives of its people, would never be a reality. In the middle of a cyclone one afternoon, which was really just nonstop rain, we closed the school to go pay our respect to the president of the Fikambana who died. I didn't know who he was, but being the president of the neighborhood was a big deal, and a line snaked out of his door and through the row of stilted huts. Woven mats of raffia were laid on the ground for people to walk on, but the mud crept over the sides, over the edge of my flip-flops, squished between my toes. Laura tried to hold an umbrella over me as if we waited in the rain, and the water fell from the spikes down the back of my neck. Men stood a short distance away, butchering a bull that had been slaughtered for the occasion. After a leg had been hacked off with a machete, a man held it aloft, trying to negotiate his way back to the huts without the benefit of the mats. His bare feet were sunk in up past his ankles, and the blood dripped in the mud he stood in, mingling together. It would eventually harden and become part of the earth. When he carried it past me, it dripped near my own feet. I willed myself not to flinch. An hour later, we climbed into the hut and saw the body lying on the bed, wrapped in gauze. Everything was dark and brown, the dried frond roof, the wooden plank floors, except through the window where rain dripped from the brilliance of banana tree leaves. Madagascar can always be described in shades of green. When I was 13, I wrote a note to my mom saying I was sorry before I put almost an entire bottle's worth of aspirin in my mouth. I spat it into the sink, crying, reveling in the melodrama, and left the note for my mom to find. The next morning, I saw she'd responded, "I'm sorry too." She thought I was referring to our fight. Another night, I grazed a serrated knife back and forth over my wrist, unknowingly the wrong way, until, from the scratching, a white line appeared, and I got too scared to do any more. After that, I gave up on suicide, too much of a coward to see it through and to endure any pain. But the feelings of self-revulsion and apathy toward anything but my dogs and books persisted until I was accepted into the drill team in high school. I'd taken dance classes as a kid that I'd never cared much about, but this somehow was different. I was good at it. It gave me an identity. Overnight, I found something to care about and work for. My body became stronger, and the exercise inevitably boosted my mood. I felt normal, In the market one day, I saw a woman coming down the street. She was wailing, scooping away the space in front of her with her arms as she stumbled, as if swimming. A man followed, a horrible grimace on his face, struggling to keep up while carrying the body of someone small. A cloth covered its head. The rain quarantined me to my house that season, a cacophony on my tin roof. I did any kind of exercise I could think of, jumping jacks, sit-ups, push-ups, dancing to my fastest music. One day I put on my running shoes and ran for 45 minutes in a circle around my room. It wasn't the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. That was really wonderful. So I'm going to read an abridged version of an essay that is part of a memoir in essays. And this project looks at the intersections of military and agricultural land use as experienced through my life as both a member of a farm family and a military family. And I am from Lockney, Texas, as said in the introduction, and I have family here, so I want to thank them for coming as well. And it does involve a little bit of family history, so take notes. If I get anything wrong, please let me know. I'll consider it. Okay. And this is titled Parent Material. Granny lived in the house on Bryant Street, one she bought in the late 60s after a fire took everything they owned, and shortly after, her own husband, A.C., died of a heart attack. In the 1980s, my own childhood, Granny's furniture looked new, although it was decades old. The drawers stayed mostly empty, the shelves bare. In her top dresser drawer, an ancient tube of rouge knocked about all in its lonesome. The entire drawer reeked of its perfume. I was a child who dug through drawers, who found her way to the shelves of closets and into the farthest corners to peek into boxes, to scavenge for clues I knew lived in my granny's silence, but that I did not yet understand. I exhausted every corner, I opened every drawer, I found very little. The questions began when I was a teenager at my grandmother's table, the only piece of furniture that revealed its true age in sharp contrast to the unscratched dressers and tables of the same vintage in other rooms. Granny, what did the A and the C stand for in AC? Don't know. We just called him AC. She did not know her husband's full name, and it had nothing to do with a failing memory. Granny picked through a small plate of salad bites, just cold samples of all the food she had made for Sunday dinner. She sipped from her coffee and took slow drags from her cigarette. Smoking was the only thing she ever seemed to do with leisurely relish. My mother had heard the story before, but she hoped my presence would shake loose a memory. Didn't AC's sisters die in a fire? As far as I know, they didn't talk much about nothing. She had triplet girls, AC's mother. One died in a fire, the others at birth, maybe. She died after AC was born. That's horrible, one of us must have said. Granny shook her head, ashed her cigarette. That's worse than horrible. And she had known enough horrible in her life to recognize what surpassed it. The moment I met my son after surgery, after my C-section, I thought he was dead. And I imagined him dying of something almost every day for his first year. I had gotten into the habit of anticipating my husband's death when he deployed to Afghanistan. It was a practice I learned as a teenager when I was a part-time caregiver to my siblings as well as 3 relatives with cancer. Picture the death, rehearse the rituals, mourn preemptively. Think about absence as the rule of life, not the exception. But instead of being in control of my anticipatory grief, these thoughts became habitual when it involved my son. I would load him into the car, check the straps on his car seat, and suddenly imagine the worst wreck possible. I would plan the funeral, and I would think about how I would deal with the artifacts of his existence, all before I started the car. To distract myself, I opened up an Ancestry.com account. I came across a name, Minnie Myrtle Mayberry, my great-grandmother. Her name puzzled me in its almost fictional quality. Minnie Myrtle was a name built for public consumption, a pseudonym like Fanny Fern, one adopted by women writers in the 19th and early 20th centuries. But in the pathetically documented history of my great-grandmother, she is voiceless, and save for the children she birthed, bodiless, appearing in census data but never in a newspaper, and as far as I can tell, never in a photo either. With a name built for documentation, she remains mostly undocumented. Little wonder, then, that her son, A.C., carried a cryptic name throughout his life. 200 billion years ago, a shallow sea covered the panhandle and south plains of Texas. Mountains folded over into basins, which then filled with sediment, making the clay beds red. Another sea crossed the plains. It crept along and then disappeared. More sediment stayed behind, just settling in. The mountain making in New Mexico and Colorado and the volcanoes of that time erupted, bringing yet more sediment south and then west. We became a plateau bordered by what geologists label rough, broken land. This border is mostly sandstone rock skimmed over the top with a thin layer of soil. Grasses grow between the rocks, ancient boulders sloughed off by the escarpment stand guard. Driving off the escarpment in Floyd County is like driving into a hole left by a meteor. And when you drive up the escarpment into Floyd County and leave behind some of the red dirt and rolling hills, the acres of mesquite, you round a corner on Highway 70, and then nothing. Flat land, endless sky, hardly a tree in sight. We are a family bereft of primary sources. No cedar hope chests full of photos, diaries, or letters, no quilts in the attic, not that there are any attics in West Texas, mostly just storm cellars, offering protection from the tornadoes that roll through every spring around planting season. No dowry chest sits down there either. There is no map to guide me, only a name found in a Bible, and a family Bible, and the skeleton of a story reluctantly told. One of the few women writers from this area in the early 20th century, Nellie Witt Spikes, wrote in one of her newspaper columns on pioneer life, "No, you would not find discarded furniture in many trunks filled with relics, for Grandpa Jones was a pioneer, and pioneers do not have room to take anything that dire necessity does not call for," end quote. And Nellie Mae Spikes' papers, I think, are here, and her book, As a Pioneer Woman Speaks, was published by Texas Tech University Press. Just side note. Nellie's parents helped settle the town of Estacado in Crosby County. They were shop owners. They put down roots even if they did not dig into the land and cultivate it. They planted the trees, though, and named the streets after them. They were there to stay. Soil surveys define parent material as the unconsolidated organic and mineral materials in which soil forms. However, it is impossible to isolate these materials to their original state. Soil scientists infer the original properties of parent material from what it has inherited from neighboring layers, also known as genetic horizons. The genetic horizons cannot be quantified. They just offer a story of how the land changed. The U.S. Department of Agriculture concludes of parent material, its mode or origin is speculative. Minnie Myrtle Mayberry was born on October 21st, 1896. She was the seventh of 13 children in an itinerant farm family that came from Arkansas in the 1880s and that lived and farmed all over Texas until the 1930s. She married Charlie Martin in 1916, had a son named Othea, sometimes called Other in census data, and possibly divorced or lost that husband to war or influenza. My great-grandfather, John Milner Gallaway, broke the alliterative chain of her name when he married her in 1918. She then had triplet girls in 1920. 2 died in childbirth, 1 died a year later in an oil well fire in Burke Burnett, Texas. She and her husband moved to Oklahoma, where she gave birth to my grandfather, A.C. She died 3 days later on July 31st, 1922. Her husband, John, left A.C. at his spinster aunt's house in Floydada, Texas. John remarried, moved out west to start another family, and died in 1969, just 2 years after AC, his very own firstborn son. In 2009, based on family lore and Ancestry.com, this was the obituary I could write for her. Some of it was true, but the worst parts were not. Giving real-life tragedy narrative form slowed the imaginary one running on a loop in my head. Medical science and an emergency C-section had saved both my son's life and my own. Myrtle did not survive the birth of my grandfather, but her story helped me approach the trauma of my son's birth by putting his birth story in perspective. Still, the narratives haunted me. I reopened Myrtle's story a few years later in 2012 after moving to South Korea, where my husband was stationed. Just weeks after we moved our family across the ocean, I learned that my father, Myrtle's grandson, had a rare and devastating genetic disease, hereditary fibrinogen A alpha chain amyloidosis. It presents itself as kidney disease and typically progresses to end-stage renal failure. After years of tests, one finally revealed the rarity of my dad's disease, especially in identifying the mutant proteins that terrorized his organs, squatting in the spaces between cells, thus suffocating them and the organ they inhabit. The abnormal deposit of amyloids, what my youngest sister calls asshole proteins, presents itself in a number of illnesses, Alzheimer's disease being the common one. Alzheimer's because it attacks around 10% of people over 65 and 50% of those over 85, garners the most attention. What my dad had was an orphan disease, not one yet adopted by drug makers. AC died in his mid-40s from cardiac occlusion, according to his death certificate. His heart just stopped after a long day of working in the fields near Austin in the middle of July. It is possible that my grandfather, the orphan, carried around the rogue proteins of an orphan illness, although it was the cardiac arrest that got him. It was likely brought on by heat stroke or the fact that he worked that land so damn hard it wore him plumb ass out, as my dad would say. Is dread something I inherited? Did my dad start expecting the worst after finding his own father dead in a hotel room when he was 19 and his father just 46? Or after he went to Vietnam, saw his friends shot down in their helicopters, greeted each day for a year with a wild vigilance that kept him alive? And what if this habit was already there? If my body was already programmed? What is written on my RNA, and how did it get there? Was Myrtle the vector? Past traumas remain in the present, and ongoing traumas can inform the future. The afterlife of trauma lives on in our genes. Our own responses to stress could have their sources in our grandparents' experiences of famine, war, and other tragedies. Most significantly, these changes can occur quickly, across one generation even. These events do not so much alter the DNA sequencing, rather traumatic events affect how the genes are expressed and packaged. What moves familial trauma around in our genes appears to be a type of migratory microRNA. But let's forget about the complexities of genetics and consider migration. There is movement of sperm to egg, of people from one place to the next. In all of life, there is migration. Migration is a matter of survival. There is motion in the pain that follows us through generations and writes itself on our bodies. We try to run from these traumas and the emotional residue left behind in our bones and in our blood. But we are all made of stories, and I am a narrative in motion. It is as if I am traveling with the past and catastrophe is on my heels. My dad once told me that coyotes, they're always running, always looking backwards, their nerves growing ragged with the wear and the tear of it all. In her 24 years, Myrtle moved at least 10 times. I can trace her movements through census data and the births of her siblings and of her own children. Her story requires a map, but maps are often inaccurate because they are flat representations of a spherical object. Boundaries change, as do the names of streets, cities, and entire counties. Rivers move, dams drown out entire towns, and the tectonic shift of the land itself creates subtle changes in our geography. If maps can construct a narrative of a story that was never told, if there can be such a thing as a cartographical narrative, then can our bodies hold the same promise? Can our bodies fill in those narrative gaps? Myrtle and John Gallaway, my great-grandparents, lived in Crosby County, 3 miles southwest of Rawls, possibly nearer to the ghost town of Emma. This was the setting of a primary trauma, the opening scene for the story of triplet girls. I searched the newspapers and archives for news of triplets, a newsworthy event in an unpopulated place in 1920. I combed through cemetery records and newspaper articles throughout Texas for the tragic death of a young girl in a fire. I could not find it. For a while, I didn't believe Myrtle had triplet girls at all, but she did have triplets. 6 pages of records filed with the county clerk give me proof enough for a story. Myrtle's girls were all born alive in their home on March 9, 1920. The first came at 3 p.m., the second 15 minutes later, and the third 15 minutes after that. The name on the death certificate is No One, a most unfortunate abbreviation for number 1. She died at 7 p.m. No 2 died at 8 p.m. No 3 lived the longest. She had her parents all to herself for an entire hour before leaving them at 9 p.m. In 6 hours, they came into this world and left it. The hours, they seemed too tidy, too precise. The story the certificates tell offers no real solace beyond the fact that Myrtle did not have to bury the burned body of an infant. It is uncertain whether these nameless girls were buried at all. I've searched the cemeteries of Crosby County. Numerous graves marked unknown child or infant could be them. Or did John and Myrtle find a place out by the barn or a tree and bury them on their own the next morning under ragweed or purple top? Did John wrap them up in an old blanket or the soiled bed sheets marked by the births and put them in the ground himself? These questions will never be answered, but one persists. Why would a family tell the story of a baby burned to death and insist that it happened when it most likely did not? Does fire enable myth? They buried their girls in Crosby County. 40 years later, a soil survey of the land in Crosby County reads, quote, "Many crops are lost and soil fertility is greatly reduced. Also, traffic accidents are common during dust storms. Insect and weed seeds are blown far and wide, and fences, hedges, and shelter beds are sometimes ruined. Dust storms are disagreeable or unbearable, both to farm families and to town and city people. In conclusion, no farm in Crosby County is safe from damage caused by high winds." It is easy to believe that nothing my great-grandmother touched survives. The fire did not take her girls, as family lore told, but it did take her son's home and all of his possessions. AC never knew what his initials signified. He changed his name from Gallaway with an O to Galloway with an A for reasons I will never learn. The fire that destroyed her son's possessions could have taken with it a baby blanket she made for him or a treasured photograph of her as a young girl. All artifacts to her memory vanished in a heap of ash. Fire seemed to follow her everywhere, such a great facilitator of silence. While silence can be its own accelerant, what is a lie? If in combustion, all that's left is ash, what is the afterlife of silence? I find solace in geography. Pulled to all the places Myrtle might have been, to look at land that had grown too familiar with new eyes. There are trees, rivers, ruins of old bridges, courthouses and storefronts, red brick streets, large immovable stones, and old wells. There is the land itself. Sometimes I imagine Myrtle as an earth eater, someone with an insatiable craving for dirt. In her life as a migrant farmer, did she miss any place the most? Here on the Llano Estacado, it is hot and dry and the winds are strong. Did Myrtle kiss her husband's neck after a long day out in the fields, tasting in the creases dirt, adding grit to the salty flavor of his sweat? Did her hunger for soil manifest itself the strongest during pregnancy, a condition known as pica, wherein pregnant women crave the soil, like I did sweet potatoes and carrots, both dirt-born tubers, during my own pregnancies. I like to think that I have tasted that same dirt once fed by the remains of her daughters, all 3 so little and so quick to turn to dust, now blown across fields of cotton and corn. I grew up in Floyd County, where Myrtle's mother-in-law lived and died, where AC was raised, where my dad farmed land. The 1978 soil survey of Floyd County, the year I was born, describes the landscape as nearly level, almost featureless plain, interrupted by numerous closed depressions. Nearly, almost. The land is too much of nothing and little of anything else. But playa lakes fill the bottoms of these depressions. Playas can come and go, be full of water one day and hidden by vegetation the next. Here, even the features of the landscape seem to migrate. Soil surveyors dig and dig until they can see the soil profile. They read the history and the layers of loam and clay and silt. They go all the way down to the parent material. They see it hasn't changed all that much. The roots of plants have left it well enough alone. Thank you.
Questions for our readers? Interesting stories. You should talk to our boss here, because she was in the Peace Corps. She loves to talk Peace Corps with you.
Okay. There's no questions then.